This is Tom Doody, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Doody in a Google search for my site. From the book Destiny of the Republic, author Candice Millard, Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President, President Garfield. Chapter 21, After All, continued. Page 227. When he was carried into his room, the first thing Garfield noticed was that the bed was turned away from the window. He asked to have it moved so that he could look out at the sea. A few days later, when he was lifted into a chair so that he could better see the wide expanse of ocean just beyond the cottage walls, he was thrilled. "This is delightful," he said. "This is such a change." Despite the relentless suffering Garfield had endured far more than 2 months, he had maintained not only the strength of mind, but the essence of his personality. Throughout his long illness, Rockwell would later recall, "I was most forcefully impressed with the manner in which those traits of his character, which were most winning in health, became intensified. Even as he lay dying, Garfield was kind, patient, cheerful, and deeply grateful. When Bliss told him that a fund was being raised for Lucretia, Garfield was overcome with gratitude. "What?" he said in surprise. Then, turning his face to his pillow to hide his emotion, he continued, "How kind and thoughtful. What a generous people." Garfield was then silent and absorbed for a long time, Bliss remembered, as if overwhelmed with the thought. Garfield was also deeply grateful to the people who had cared for him for so long and with such devotion. One day, he placed his hand on the head of one of his attendants and said, "You have been always faithful and forbearing." For Bliss, who was visibly weakened by exhaustion and worry, he tried to provide measure of comfort. "Doctor, you plainly show the effect of all this care and unrest," he said. "Your anxious watching will soon be over." Bliss still refused to admit that he could not save the president's life. A few days after they arrived in Elberon, he issued a bullet announcing that the last of his attending physicians had been dismissed, leaving him with only an occasional assistance from the surgeon, Agnew and Hamilton. Garfield was doing so well, Bliss explained in his bulletin, that he wished to relieve the doctors from the labor and responsibility which in his improved condition could no longer impose upon them. To a reporter from the Washington Post, Bliss said to Garfield that he had a clearer road to recovery now that he has ever had. There was no abscess, no pus cavity, no beyone, he insisted. "The trouble has now passed its crisis and is going away." Bliss's assurances, however, no longer went unquestioned. Despite the announcement that the condition of the president is hopeful and that he is making slight gains daily, a reporter for Medical Record wrote, "It is quite evident that his chances for ultimate recovery are very poor indeed." Even Agnew admitted to his friend that he thought the president had very few days left to live. "He may live out the day," he said, "and possibly tomorrow, but he cannot live a week." Garfield was perfectly calm. "Sentient," Bliss wrote. content to live out his days in the borrowed cottage, gazing at the sea. The president could not help but wonder, however, if after such a brief presidency, he would leave behind any lasting legacy. Do you think my name will have a place in human history? He asked Rockwell one night. Yes, his friend replied, a grand one, but a grander place in human hearts. Rockwell was again with Garfield on the evening of September 19th. The president had been suffering from chills, fever, and persistent cough, but still he longed for companionship. Look over at his friend with whom he had passed many happy evenings. He lifted his hands slightly above the bed covers and wistfully pantomimed, dealing a deck of cards. Soon after, Swain arrived to relieve Rockwell for the night, and Garfield fell asleep. At 10 p.m., as Swain sat in silence in the president's room, he suddenly heard Garfield make a gasping sound, as if he were struggling to speak. Rushing to his bedside, he saw, by the light of a single candle, Garfield's eyes, and looked at him for the moment. "Well, Swain," he said, and suddenly, pressing his hand to his heart, he cried out, "Oh my, Swain, what a pain I have right here." Bliss was in his room, reading through the daily multitude of letters offering sympathy and medical advice, wonderful proclamations of the human imagination, when one of Garfield's attendants appeared at the door. "General Swain wants you quick," he said. As soon as he reached the room, Bliss knew that there was nothing he could do. Garfield was unconscious, his breathing shallow and fast. "My God, Swain!" "Bliss," he cried. Moments later, Lucretia, who had been woken by an attendant, was standing near Bliss, looking at her husband in terror. "Oh," she said, "what's the matter?" For once, Bliss had no words of encouragement to offer the lady. "Miss Garfield," he replied quietly, "the president is dying." As Lucretia bent over James, kissing his brow, the attendant sent word throughout the house and to nearby cottages. One of the first to come was Joseph Stanley Brown. For the rest of his life, Brown would write, he would hear the long, solemn roll of the sea on the shore, as I did on that night of inky darkness when I walked from my cottage to his bedside. Before many minutes had passed, the room was filled with everyone who had come with them to Elberon. Garfield's surgeons, his friends, and his 14-year-old daughter, Molly. Garfield, surgeons, his friends, and 14-year-old daughter, Molly. They were, Bliss would later write, the witnesses of the last sad scene of a sorrowful history. As Bliss tried in vain to stop what was happening, he could feel Garfield slip away. A faint, fluttering pulsation of the heart. He would remember, gradually fading to indistinctiveness. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the president's ragged, irregular breathing. And finally, 10:35 p.m., Bliss raised his head from Garfield's chest. "It's over," he said. There was not a moment of sound or even crying. All hearts, Bliss would write, were stilled. After a moment, the room slowly began to empty until Lucretia was left alone with James. She sat by his bed for more than an hour, staring at his frail, lifeless body. Finally, Rockwell returned, gently touching her arm, begging her to retire. Without a word, she stood and allowed him to lead her away. This has been Tom Doody, middle-aged American, living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Doody in a Google search for my site. Thank you for listening. Have a good day, good evening, or restful night's sleep. Ciao.